Wow. At least this is being recorded in case people don't get the wrong email link. But I sent out the correct email link, and I sent out the correct Zoom link, and I sent out the just yesterday and again this morning. And that's the one I logged on with. So hopefully everyone has it.
So Nancy, I logged on with the link that shared by Alexis and worked fine.
Okay.
Yep,
Good.
as did I.
Navin.
Hi.
Good. Hi, Pinky.
Hi, Pinky.
How are you, Navin?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Sorry, I couldn't be there in person, but
I know. Well, Balshir was here last week, and he didn't have a
I know.
pleasant, travel. So
Oh,
I totally
I
understand.
heard.
His flights got canceled on both ways, so
Yeah,
it's
I
such a
heard.
hassle these days.
Yeah, I hate traveling as it is, even when it's pleasant. But yeah,
But we are happy to have you, even if virtually.
thank you. Yeah, hopefully one day I'll come in person, but
Absolutely.
it's a long way.
We look forward to it.
Thanks. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, mid-semester, so it's almost coming down a bit, but also looking forward to December, AGU, AG
Right.
deadlines coming up. So, it's that time of the year.
Yeah. So you're going to the AGU?
My two students are presenting, but both are doing virtually. One of them will actually be defending around that time. So the timing didn't quite work out. And they're not very thrilled about winter in Chicago. But all my students will be going to AG in person, which is Denver, March. So hopefully it'll be much better.
Okay. Yeah.
Great. Well, let's get started, and especially since we start with some announcements and a diversity share, and then if there are people slowly coming on, then they won't miss anything. So I want to welcome you all, and I noticed that our participation extends from Gabon in Africa to Salim, where Salim is, to British Columbia, where Navin Ramankutty is. So welcome to everyone. I'm Nancy Boyer. I'm on the faculty at the Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences, and it's my special privilege and pleasure to welcome Dr. Navin Ramankutty as our guest speaker today. But as is our tradition, we start with announcements. So if anyone has any special announcements for this week, papers published, presentations made, new baby, anything, please unmute yourself and tell us the details. I take that's no announcements. Anything in the chat? No. Well, second item is whether or not anyone has any diversity shares. Is there anything that brought more diversity, equity, or inclusion into your lives this past week? And I will add one, through an announcement from Dana Barone, which came from Victor Perez in the sociology department. There was an environmental justice event that was held as part of Peace Week Delaware. And it was a really great event about environmental justice here in Delaware. 2 state legislators were on the call, as well as the president of the Sierra Club, as well as community leaders that are concerned with environmental justice along the Route 9 corridor, as well as the Crota plant that's habitual offender in Wilmington and trying to do things better. So,
Nancy, may I do a quick announcement, a diversity announcement?
Please.
So I'm sure Dr. Niller has mentioned that before, but she will be attending the SACNAS event, which is a conference end of this month, and I will be attending virtually just the recruitment booth. And I'm sure if my other fellow faculty members are interested, there's still spots to sign up for. So I just wanted to remind everyone that, even if you are not planning to travel to Puerto Rico end of this month, there's still possibility to sign up virtually.
Wonderful. Do you want to put any links in the chat or send it to the CEOE announcer?
Sure, I'll
That'd be
do
great.
Thanks.
So to introduce Dr. Ramankutty, Navin, I'd first like to, I'd like to introduce him as the 2020 awardee of the Wahuri International Prize. And I want to show you what that prize is. That it's awarded in recognition of furthering the cultural and economic development of mankind, which I think is pretty amazing. And so Navin is as professor and Canada Research Chair in Data Science for Sustainable Global Food Systems at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability at the University of British Columbia. He trained originally as an engineer, but his interest shifted over to climate science, global ecosystem science, and land and food science. Today, his research uses global Earth observations, geospatial analysis, and ecosystem models to understand how humans use and modify the Earth's land surface for agriculture, to evaluate global environment consequences and explore solutions to the problem of feeding humanity with minimal global environmental footprint. He's been on the board of major committees and journals. And so I'd like to, without further ado, turn this over to Navin. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to give this seminar. And I was invited to be there in person, but I'm sorry I couldn't make that happen. As I was telling Piki earlier, I hate travel, and I'm grateful that you allowed me to join remotely. And thanks, Nancy, for that embarrassing introduction. Furthering the economic and cultural aspects of mankind. I'm like, who's that? Anyway, today I'd like to, let me share my screen first. Is that coming through?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about a particular aspect of my work, which is on looking at how I'm going to talk about sustainable food systems and those challenges, and asking whether alternative agriculture, different forms of agriculture can solve our challenges. Agriculture is a major driver of global environmental change. This is the global map of the world's agricultural lands that my research team developed using both satellite data as well as ground-based information. The greenish colors are places in croplands, and the orange colors are places that we use for grazing. So fully a third of the world's land used for producing food for humans. To me, I did this work back in my PhD 20 years ago, and this still, every time I think about it, astounds me that one species is essentially using or appropriating a third of the world's land for providing resources for itself. But it's not just the extent of agriculture that's the story. We also need to think about how we are using these lands. And we've, in the last 50 years, especially greatly intensified our use of agricultural lands. For example, by irrigation, fertilizer use of pesticides, and so on. And this has resulted in major changes. So this shows just one example of corn yields in the United States. Back in the 1800s, it was 1.5 to 2 tons per hectare, but now we are above 10 tons per hectare. So this has been this has had huge impacts. In some ways, we essentially managed to produce more food than ever before. This is an increase in 7 times. If you look at total number of calories produced per person globally, since 1960, that's increased from 2,100 to nearly 3,000 kilocalories per person. If you look at how populations have grown since 2000, even though populations have increased over time, the number of undernourished people on the planet, even though we have not managed to decrease it, it's remained roughly stable. So in some ways, you can say this is a huge success that the world as a whole, even though our numbers have been going up, we've been producing enough calories per person. But this success comes at a large cost. Agriculture is the major threat for biodiversity loss on the planet due to habitat destruction. Is the biggest user of fresh water on the planet. This image just shows the Aral Sea, which I think most of you probably know the story of the Aral Sea. It's been completely depleted due to irrigating cotton, as well as a major source of freshwater pollution. A lot of our lakes and coastal ecosystems are eutrophied because of the excess nitrogen and phosphorus that runs into them from our agricultural fields. And when we think about climate change, we usually think about buildings, cars, heating, and so on. But agriculture is also a major contributor to climate change through deforestation that causes CO2 emissions, livestock and rice paddy cultivation that results in methane emissions, which is an even more powerful greenhouse gas, as well as fertilizer use that results in nitrous oxide emissions. So if you ask, if you look at global environmental problems around the world and ask what's the role of agriculture in it as compared to other causes, if you take greenhouse gas emissions, it's estimated that about 26% of our greenhouse gas emissions is from agriculture. And a recent paper said if you look at the entire food system, it's closer to 33%. For biodiversity loss, agriculture is the major cause of biodiversity loss on the planet. For birds, for which we have better data, 60% of threats to birds in terms of threats to extinction is from agriculture. Agriculture is responsible for, actually this is needs to be changed, 70% of freshwater withdrawal and 85% of freshwater consumption around the planet. It's also responsible for about 80% of eutrophication. So it is a major cause of global environmental problems. But at the same time, we continue to have 800 million people undernourished on this planet, with degrees of undernourishment really high in places like sub-Saharan Africa. We're talking about undernourishment rates of 35% and above. And this is not malnourishment. This is purely just not getting enough calories. And on top of that, our numbers are going to keep going up. We are almost at 8 billion, expected to get to 10 billion, maybe even 11, according to some projections. And people are eating more calories per capita, essentially through eating more meat-intensive diets. And by some estimates, we'll need to double food production into the future. Some estimates by 2050 even. So I think of this as the kind of a food quadrilemma, that we have to solve 4 problems at the same time. We have to feed the people of today. We have to feed the people of tomorrow. We have to, at the same time, reduce agriculture's environmental footprint. And at the same time now, we are also seeing how climate change is, agriculture is a contributor to climate change, but agriculture is a recipient of climate change as well, as our food production systems are affected by climate change. And I think one of my former PhD students gave a seminar last week in your seminar, talking about the climate impacts in agriculture. So a major question that myself but many other colleagues around the world are working on is, how can we improve food security while reducing the environmental footprint of agriculture? For those who think in SDG terms, reducing hunger is SDG 2. SDGs 12, 13, and 15 relate to sort of the environmental footprint, talking about life on land, the climate aspects, as well as responsible production and consumption. So how do we do this? How can we solve this problem? And when you read the literature, or when you read the news, or when you look at action around the world, there are a whole bunch of solutions out there. It's a whole plethora of solutions that people talk about. Organic agriculture. 1 second, I need to move the slide out of the way. People talk about organic agriculture, sustainable intensification, agroecology. Maybe we can do vertical farming, grow our food in big tall towers, or use empty spaces in urban areas. Others argue for genetically modified food as a potential solution. Yet others say we should eat more locally, or maybe we should switch our consumption habits to become vegan or eat more insects, which are more efficient way of getting protein. Others focus on food waste reductions. Still others talk about changing the entire food system to talk about, changing power dynamics and focusing on food sovereignty or supporting smallholders. So, for me, when I look at these kind of plethora of solutions, it's a little hard to get your head around, which ones should we focus on? Should we focus on all of them? What kind of leverage do they have? So some of the work that my group has been doing over the last few years has been to try to look at some of these and ask, what do we know about them and their performance? So today I'm going to talk about two of them. I'm going to talk about organic agriculture, as well as smallholders, and ask, what do we know about these two forms of agriculture and their performance? So the next section, I'm going to talk about whether organic farming is better than conventional farming. This is the work of a former PhD student, Verena Seifert. If you want to look up more of her work, there's a link to her website. Organic farming is a type of farming system that in some ways people equate this to kind of traditional farming systems, but it is a little bit more than that. It's a kind of, in some ways, it's actually an intensive system, but it's much more knowledge intensive. In principle, the fundamental, if you look at the theoretical development of organic agriculture, the idea is to farm in a way that provides healthy ecosystems, healthy animals, and healthy people. But a lot of people argue that, if you farm through organic practices, organic agriculture has low yields, which means that to produce the same amount of food, you would need more land. And if you need more land, you're probably going to clear it. And often that clearing happens through deforestation. So a lot of times organic agriculture is dismissed from the get-go because of its lower yields. But there have been studies that have tried to estimate the yields of organic agriculture relative to conventional. But these estimates, and sometimes they're not really estimates, I would say they're claims, they range widely. Some people said organic agriculture has yields that are 50% lower. But a paper in 2007 argued that organic agriculture has yields that is 30+% higher than conventional agriculture. So when this paper in 2007 was published, that paper was heavily criticized by a lot of people for the way it collected data and the way it did the analysis. So my student Verena said, I think we can do a better job of that. And so she published a study in 2012 where we did a meta-analysis of existing studies. We found 66 different comparative studies, around 300 observations of organic and conventional yields. So these are experimental plots where people grow organic agriculture in one field right next to a conventional plot, conventionally managed plot, and then compare the yields. There are lots of experiments like this around the world. And since we've done this study, of course, there's even more data out there. Our findings are here, and this graph shows the organic to conventional yield ratio on the x-axis. So you can think of it as a yield gap. So if the values are less than 1, it means organic has lower yields, and the values are higher than 1, organic has higher yields. And so on average, we found that I don't know if you can see the little box there on top, that for across all crops, on average, we found that organic yields were indeed lower by about 25%. But then we found that there was a lot of differences depending on the crop type. For example, fruits did not seem to have a significant difference in terms of yields, but for vegetables, there seemed to be high difference in terms of yields. And we were able to explain that in terms of the plant types. So we argued, for example, that legumes and perennials, the yield gaps between organic and conventional are indistinguishable, at least statistically zero, while non-legumes and annuals have large yield differences. So one of the interesting things we did in the paper was to not just look at yield gaps on average, but also ask under what context do the yields differ. And so we found that organic performance is highly context dependent, and that the best performance is for legumes and perennials in rain-fed conditions, in particular soils that are neither too acidic nor alkaline, in longer established sites, in the sense that with organic agriculture, once you transition from conventional to organic, usually yield drops really rapidly, but then over time, yields can come back up. And so if you have comparisons that are much longer, it seems the yield gaps reduce. And also when organic agriculture, when people are using best management practices, because of organic is more knowledge intensive. So organic yields are lower. So what? Why should we care about it? A lot of people would argue, I don't go to the grocery store to buy organic food because I worry about the yields. I'm worried about other environmental benefits it has. So Verena and I did a study, a kind of a systematic review study where we reviewed organic performance across 11 different dimensions and 26 different criteria. So instead of, in this particular case, in the framing, we said, let's start by saying, what are the things we care about with organic agriculture, and then go and collect data rather than saying what data is out there. So the 11 dimensions and 26 criteria were across these 4 broad categories. So we wanted to look at yields or productivity. We wanted to look at environmental outcomes. We wanted to look at benefits for producers, the farmers, as well as benefits for consumers. I'm just going to focus on the environmental outcomes for the moment. We found that organic agriculture does seem to have a lot of environmental benefits. In this flower diagram, the red circle shows if the petals of the flower lie on the red circle, then organic and conventional have similar yields. If the petals are outside the red circle, then organic is better than conventional. So we found that organic seems to have higher species richness, higher abundance of species, greater soil organic matter, lower nitrogen losses to the ecosystems, not huge difference in phosphorus loss, lower nitrous oxide emissions, but it did seem to have, the only case where it seemed to be worse was in terms of methane emissions, and also lower energy use. But the interesting thing here was that these comparisons, the environmental benefits, were measured per unit area. So people compared a 1 hectare plot of organic, for example, against a 1 hectare plot of conventional. But as we've already seen, organic has lower yields. And so the 2 hectares are not producing the same amount of food. So the way to really compare the environmental outcomes would be to control them for the differences in yield. So for producing the same quantity of food, how do these environmental outcomes compare? But it's kind of interesting. There are not many studies that did that. A lot of studies measured the environmental outcomes, but didn't measure yields. And a lot of studies measured yields when they're looking at yield differences, but didn't measure environmental outcomes. So one of the results of our study was that looking at environmental outcomes per unit product, there were far fewer studies available. So there are many more shades of gray in our petal. But also, as you can notice, that the petals have now shrunk, which means per unit product, the environmental outcomes seem to be worse. So here, organic is doing better than conventional per unit area, but per unit product, it's doing worse in some outcomes. So the bottom line is that organic farming clearly has environmental benefits per unit area, but no strong evidence per unit output. And yeah, I guess we need many more studies where we look at both yields and environmental outcomes, and being done in many different contexts. This is the full picture, which includes the environmental and social outcomes. I don't have time to go through all of the petals, but we did find in terms of socioeconomic outcomes that organic agriculture does seem to have higher profits for farmers. And this is because of the premium income that people get from producing organic food or selling organic food. It does seem to have benefits in terms of rural employment, partly because organic agriculture is labor intensive, so it provides more employment. It also seems to, this is a very controversial topic, but at least our kind of read of the health literature seem to suggest that organic agriculture has health benefits for health, human health. And the biggest petal there, as you can see, is lower pesticide residues on organic food. So that's a major health outcome and major reason why consumers buy organic food. But on the flip side, organic has the consumer prices, the higher prices for organic agriculture is a problem for consumers. Okay, Okay, now I'm going to switch and ask, so with organic agriculture, we seem to have trade-offs. What about farms, smaller farms? A lot of people argue that smaller farms are better. This is the work of another former PhD student, Vinny Ricciardi. Again, there's a web link there if you want to go see what he's doing now. A lot of studies that have argued that smaller farms are more productive than larger farms, that they host more agrobiodiversity, that they're more resilient to climate change. You can probably list a whole bunch of those. But we also hear frequently that, a lot of people argue that 70 to 80% of the world's food is produced by smallholders. A lot of FAO reports have said that. A lot of big UN reports make this claim. So one of the things that the reason I started working in this area of smallholders is when I was first confronted by this statistic, and I just thought, how do we know that? What kind of data do we have to support this claim? And when I started looking into where the source of this data came from, I realized that there's a lot more work that could be done to investigate this. So Vinny decided to take it on for his PhD, and he collected a bunch of global data. We don't have really good data for everywhere in the world, so it was kind of a convenient sample. But we found national census or survey data, as well as microdata for about 55 countries, about 150 crops. The time period ranged because the censuses are conducted at different time periods. So roughly around the year 2013. So it doesn't cover the entire global production. It's about 50% of the world's production in terms of both production and area. But some big countries are missing, like we didn't have China, for example. I'm not going to go into the methods, but essentially we compiled this national data and asked, how much of the world's food is produced by smallholders. The first thing is the definition of what is small itself is really confusing. But a global number that people often use is 2 hectares as a threshold. So small farms are those that are less than 2 hectares. But of course, we can define it in different ways. If you use the 2 hectare definition, we found that about 30 to 34% of the world's food is produced by farms less than 2 hectares. But on the other hand, that's much less than the 70 to 80% number, but it is, they are doing it on 24% of the land. So smallholders do seem to be producing more food disproportionately compared to the amount of land base that they occupy. If you want to get to the 70 to 80% number, you need to go to farm sizes as high as 50 to 100 hectares before you get to that threshold of 70 to 80%. Using that same data, we further analyzed it in terms of the crop production, whether that's used for food versus feed versus processing, farm seed waste, and so on. We also found that smaller farms disproportionately produce more food and use less of their products going to processing or seed production. We also found that in terms of crop species richness, that smaller farms, this is on the left, have higher crop species richness. So they grow more varieties of different crops. But then we also did an analysis comparing small farms to large farms. So this is a slightly complicated map. It's a heat map that shows the correlation between small farms and large farms. So you have farm size on both axes. And the dark blue color shows higher correlation and the orange color shows lower correlation. So just to walk you through that graph, the bottom left quadrant shows that small farms grow similar crops as other small farms. So if you're comparing 2 small farms in 2 different places. At the same time, we find that large farms actually grow similar crops as other large farms. But if you go across the other axis, you find that small farms and large farms grow very different kinds of crops. So they're not correlated with each other in terms of the crops. So there's also a question about, we can talk about small farms having more crop diversity, but at the landscape level, in fact, we suggest that it might be better to have farms of different sizes in terms of diversity because they grow different kinds of crops. So landscape diversity might be higher if you have farm sizes that are diverse as well. Okay, so we talked about productivity, we talked about species richness, but come back to the same question. What about environmental aspects of small farms? We don't just care about yield and how much food they produce. So Vinny did another kind of systematic review / meta-analysis where he asked these questions: do smaller farms have higher yields? I think we already have a hint of that. Whether they have higher biodiversity, higher greenhouse gas emissions, higher resource use efficiency, and higher profits. And just going to give you some of the bottom line messages. We did two kinds of analysis here. One analysis was just simply what we call vote counting. So you would look at a paper and say, what did this paper find in terms of small farms having higher yields or lower yields? And our vote count analysis showed that of all the studies, that there's a higher probability that a study would find that small farms have higher yields and higher biodiversity. But when you look at resource efficiency and profits, there was no significant differences across farm size. So these were just vote count results, but for four of our outcome variables, we also had data on the actual, the effect sizes that the studies reported. So studies didn't just say small farms are better than large farms, they also said how much better. So then we were able to do kind of a meta regression. So we took the original regression coefficients and then we were able to put them into a meta regression. And our results showed that for every 1 hectare increase in farm size, we found that yields on average seem to decrease by about 5%, but no significant differences for greenhouse gas emissions, profits, or for resource efficiency. But so small farms seem to be good at many things, but this is a study that's unpublished. It's from Vinny's PhD thesis, and I must say, I'm sorry, apologize for the poor figure. We still need to work on this. But we also found that smaller farms have lower profits per capita compared to larger farms. So small farms are great in so many ways, but it's actually not profitable for the farmer. So to summarize kind of my research on both organic and small farms, organic farming has environmental benefits, but it has trade-offs with lower yields and higher prices. And the benefits per unit product are unclear. Smaller farms are great in terms of having higher yields, and they do seem to host more agrodiversity in terms of cross-species richness as well as non-crop biodiversity, but they seem to have trade-offs with lower profits. So, they're great, but it's not something that works for a farmer, especially in today's socioeconomic landscape. So the implications of my work are as follows. I've come to realize I've done a lot of work over the last 10 years on looking at farm management practices and improving them, but I'm coming to realize that changing farm management practices or shifting to alternative agriculture is not going to be enough to solve these problems. I sort of thinking of it as fiddling at the margins, that yes, it's important to continue to work on these things, but we're not going to address the scale of the problem that we currently face. And on the other hand, there are lots of studies that have shown that demand side solutions, shifting diets or reducing food waste have huge leverage. And that by focusing on kind of not just solving the agriculture problems, but solving the food system problems, we can have a bigger leverage. So the bottom line, in terms of how I think about this problem now, is that leveraging both supply and demand side solutions can more effectively address our food system challenge. And in a recent opinion paper, one of my colleagues at UBC and I took some inspiration from a paper that was published by Amory Levinson, an energy policy thinker from the 1970s, who was thinking about the United States and how to provide, how to meet energy demands in the United States. And so back in the 70s, the way people used to think about it is demand is going to go up for energy, and so we need to produce more energy. So we need to build more power plants. But Amory Levinson argued that that's only one way to meet energy demand. The other way is to actually think about reducing demand itself and increasing the efficiency of appliances and so on. So he called that a soft energy path compared to a hard path, which is just to build more power plants. So I think we can take inspiration from that and argue that we need to have soft paths also for a sustainable food system. We need to focus on reducing overall demand through either reducing dietary excess, Today, for example, estimates show that in North America and Europe, people eat 2 times the amount of meat required to have a, recommended for a healthy diet. So the WHO recommends that we should eat about 40 grams of meat per day, but people eat about 80 grams of meat per day. So shifting to plant-based diets can be beneficial, not only for the planet, but also for health, in fact. And we're also diverting a lot of our foods to biofuels and other industrial products. We also need to focus on improving efficiency, both at the farm level through improving water and nutrient use efficiency, but also through reducing food loss and waste in the supply chain. It's estimated that roughly 1/3 of the world's food is wasted or lost. And at the same time, you can also focus on making agriculture more environmentally friendly through whatever your favorite method, maybe organic or agroecological, regenerative agriculture or smallholders. We still don't know whether all of these will have positive outcomes, win-win solutions, but we need to be running more experiments, trying various different solutions out in different places. But the bottom line is that there's no panacea. No one solution is going to help address these problems. With that, I will end. Thank you very much.
Great.
And I'm happy
Thank
to
you,
take
Navin.
questions.
Yeah, any questions now? And if you'd be so kind as just to unmute yourself to ask your question, we can work the chat here, but I think it's, I like the rapport of people unmuting themselves to ask a question. Any questions?
Yes, greetings, Navin. Can you hear me okay? Hello?
Yes, I can. Hi,
Yes,
Salim.
okay.
Yes, I can
Thank
hear
you
you.
very much. Thank you again for doing this. And we had the pleasure of hosting one of your students in person last week. So we are really UBC fan club here. So yeah, with reference to, I think, your willingness to take this on is fantastic. And one of my roles is I serve on the science panel for the Global Environment Facility. And these are precisely the kinds of issues which we're trying to bring to the donors in terms of how they approach investments in agriculture and food. One of the things that keeps coming up in the last year when we are having conversations is the Sri Lankan crisis. And I'm wondering if you can shed some light on what your diagnosis is on that, since you are from the region. And I know it's different from India, but still there are some similarities perhaps as to what happened there, because the right of the political spectrum, they blame it on organic farming and the financial collapse and all. So it'd be good to, maybe you can also give a quick background on that, because everyone might not know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Thank you for that. It's a really interesting case study. So in Sri Lanka, there was a huge financial crisis last year. People essentially ran the government out of town. And a lot of people argued that a shift to organic farming in the previous year was the cause of that. So the previous year, it was the Rajapaksa government had at some point, I think, anyway, I won't go into the details, but they basically banned the imports of chemical fertilizers into Sri Lanka, and they essentially, forcing farmers to go organic. And the story goes that the yields dramatically dropped, and farmers essentially went into debt, and that frustration led to, the collapse of the government. So after that happened, that story has been presented as, look, here's the failure of organic agriculture. I'm not from Sri Lanka, but I'm from India, and I've read different articles and different opinions written about that. And the best way to say this is probably that in the world of agriculture, people are really divided across the spectrum of either you're pro-organic or anti-organic. And the same thing in agroecology, you're either pro-agroecology or you're pro-GM, right? Like there's no middle ground there. So my own diagnosis is that, so reading articles on this doesn't help, because people seem to write it from they already have an opinion on this issue, and then they're they're right about that opinion. My own kind of feeling on it is that, so I think my study showed that when you transition from conventional agriculture to organic agriculture, there's immediately a steep drop in yields. So you've been farming for many decades with not in a conventional way, using irrigation, synthetic fertilizers, mechanization, and so on. And that arguably will drop, it'll make the soil more infertile over time. It will compact the soil, it'll reduce soil organic matter, it reduces soil biodiversity, and so on. And you'll be making up for that by using inputs. So when you transition away from that towards organic farming, you're going to see a drop in productivity right away, until over time you manage your soils in a different way, and the soil organic matter builds up, the soil biota comes back, and so on. So we usually find a sharp decrease in yields, and then it comes back up. And so my study, the meta-analysis, also shows that when you look at these organic conventional comparisons, over time the yield gap seems to be closing. So what actually happens in reality, people recognize that there is this transition period. There's also a transition period for about 3 years when you cannot sell your produce in the conventional market using, you can't get the premium prices for about 3 years after transition. And so farmers have a hard time making that transition. So typically when you want to support a transition over time, you want to recognize that these things are happening, that you have a drop in productivity. So you don't want to do it very suddenly. You want to have some kind of support system in place for 3 to 5 years so that the organic farming, can build up. So my sense is that the government did it too rapidly, and yields did drop, and the farmers had no support system. The second thing is, of course, the financial crisis. There were a lot of other things going on at the same time. It was not just the transition into organic farming. I feel that was maybe one of multiple things that happened at the same time that caused the crisis. So I don't have a full understanding of why the financial crisis happened. That's not my expertise, but my sense on the organic piece there is that it was done too early.
Mm-hmm. Great. No, thank you so much. And I think your point about this polarized discourse in agroecology, and this is true of many areas. Mining is the same way. My empirical work is primarily in the extractive industry. It's the same way. It's so polarized. Either you're for it or you're against it, and very little in between. And I think this is where geographers and our graduate students being in the audience, I think, should think about their original contributions, because unfortunately, I think a lot of geography literature has fallen into that trap also. It's very, very polarized. In fact, it's more polarized in one area. It's very critical geography of everything neoliberal. So
Another question.
I can see everyone, so if you have questions, please unmute and speak up.
I'd like to ask.
I can stop sharing if that's helpful. Sorry.
Okay.
yes,
back
I
in the
think that would be
70s,
good.
Yeah. Back in the 70s, Francis Moore Lepay wrote a book called Diet for a Small Planet, and followed by Recipes for a Small Planet. And
yeah.
And I wondered if that has been translated into any empirical research. And you mentioned like changing diet to a plant-based diet. Is there?
Yeah.
The research is on that.
Yeah. So the most recent well-known work on that is the EAT Lancet report. EAT is a foundation in Denmark, and Lancet is a health journal. So they developed a commission of both health and ecological scholars to come up with something that they call the planetary health diet. I can't remember which year, but it came out in the last couple of years. And so the planetary health diet is a diet that's good for human health, but also good for the planet. So yeah, I don't think they have recipes per se, but they do have kind of representative plates for different cultures, different regions of the world that would, give you a healthy diet. I must say I don't know if I have a slide on that. Let me see if I can. Yeah, I do. So I'll just share my slide again. The Canada Food Guide I find quite inspirational. And I have this, so this is the most recent Canada Food Guide, and I print this out and put it up next to my dining table to kind of inspire my kids. So this Canada Food Guide was developed a couple of years ago, and the food guide basically shows that half of your plate should be composed of fruits and vegetables. Another quarter should be protein foods. They didn't say what those proteins should be. They didn't say that was meat and dairy. They said it should be protein. So you can see that there are chickpeas and yogurt and other forms of protein there, tofu. And then another quarter should be carbohydrates, and they recommend choosing whole grain foods. The really interesting thing about that is, so this kind of matches up with the Eat Planetary Health Diet of the Eat Lancet report, which is shown here. I'll remove that table. And their plate is similar. Half the plate is fruits and veggies, and then you have a bunch of whole grains and plant source proteins and so on. And they actually have recommendations of how many micrograms or you should eat of these different categories, right? The story about the Canada Food Guide is that this is the first time that the Canada Food Guide did not have a category for meat and dairy. They explicitly left it out as a category on the plate. It used to be 4 categories, now it's down to 3. And the meat and dairy industry was not at all happy about it in Canada. There was a lot of protests. But the health minister at that time explicitly decided not to consult with industry when making the food guide. So they said, we're going to take an evidence-based approach. We're going to take papers on diets and human health, review them, and come up with this food guide. So that's great. So this is what they recommend as a healthy diet. What's really interesting is that I think this is also a diet that's better for the planet, right? Because there's far less meat on this plate than would be otherwise.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and sorry, just to continue on that theme, since others should feel free to chime in, but the use of alternative proteins, I mean, the plate, it shows some meat looking stuff, but it could be like Impossible Burger meat or something. But there are life cycle analysis studies being done about the ecological impact and so on. And clearly, I mean, there's no doubt that that kind of protein-based meat is generally going to come out better. Synthetic proteins. But what are your thoughts on that whole industry? And now it's taking on many different angles. They've got they're trying to make artificial meat out of cells. Then there are the other alternative proteins.
Yeah, I used to be skeptical about them, and I've come around in some ways. I used to be skeptical, thinking there's no way they can be affordable. But there are people running these experiments. Let them run the experiments and see what happens. Now, I mean, they're actually selling in the market, and the price premium of the Impossible Burger compared to a regular one is not that bad. I think it's a great shift, a great new innovation in many ways. The New York Times conducted taste tests of the Impossible Burger compared to a real burger, and people could not distinguish the two in double-blind tests. The one criticism that I've heard that I don't know a lot about is that there's the general recommendation in terms of healthy diets is to eat less processed food, and the Possible Burgers and the Beyond Burgers are some of the most highly processed foods. But then there's a counter argument that not all processed foods are bad. Like refined sugars are bad, but doesn't mean that all processed foods are bad. In terms of the cellular meat, which is growing meat in a petri dish, I think again, I'm skeptical now because I think they are far too expensive. I think there's a $10,000 burger or something, the first cellular meat burger produced in Maastricht University. But maybe over time, those are also going to go down in price.
Yeah.
Sorry, I can keep talking about that, but see if
Yeah,
others have
no,
questions.
that's great. Certainly, others should chime in.
I can ask a
Becca.
question if no one else has anything. Hi,
Yes.
Navin, I'm Becca Nixon. Thanks for your talk and for all of the work that goes into the meta-analyses. I know those can be massive undertakings. I was wondering about your perspective on, mostly from the perspective of the states. I've done work in the Midwest with small farmers, and one of the findings from our work there was that profit and yield in some cases wasn't a motivating factor in their farming, and they were thinking more of the community perspective and environmental benefits, and that would often work off farm, right, for increased income. So I was wondering what you thought about those types of systems fitting into these models and how you might include them, or if they are represented in those models.
They are not, but it's a great question, right? So both in the US and in Canada, there's a phenomenon of what they call the missing middle. So farms, in terms of farm sizes, some farms are consolidating, but the small farms seem to be surviving. And it's precisely what you said. A lot of them are getting off farm income. They're doing farming for other reasons. And I think that's great. But we still have a missing middle. And in terms of what the outcomes of that missing middle are, I think, you know, there are lots and lots of small farms, but the land base that they occupy is still tiny, because there are even a few large farms still occupy the majority of the world's land base. And then if you take that to a context of the developing countries like India, Africa, South America, you know, majority of the farms in terms of numbers are small farms. And it's a very different context. I think they do struggle, but I don't know how much more off-farm income that they can make. My perspective on that is that from small farmers in developing countries, for sure, are some of the poorest people on the planet. So at least from a purely development perspective, we need to be supporting them. And if there's evidence that they actually have positive outcomes for yields or biodiversity or other environmental outcomes, then we need to design public policy to support them. So I think there's evidence that there's an argument to be made that we need to have public policy to support smallholders, both for humanitarian as well as environmental reasons. In the North American context, it's slightly different, because I think small farmers are doing quite well by, as you say, finding other kinds of ways to earn their income off farm.
Great, thanks, Navin.
I just a related question to this one is around, you know, in the developing world, as you know, of course, there's the land grab literature, and Kyle Davis, whom I think invited you as well, has written quite a bit on the land grab with Jean-Paul Delangelo and others. Is there some good research in terms of, in the developing world, the impact of these? Because I mean, I can see the land grabs having clearly a negative impact, and we've you know, seen that demonstrably with a lot of issues with the farmer suicides, other things. But what about the way in which are there cases where the income from the sale of that land has been used in productive ways by the smallholders? Because otherwise they're subsistence oriented, whereas now they could do something else, or a transition. It's more the transition literature, sort of economics of transition.
Yeah, I don't know enough to answer that question. I haven't followed that literature too closely. My sense is precisely as you say, that there are trade-offs in terms of land grabs, like especially if it's forced on you, obviously, as in some countries where if you don't have land rights, you lose your land and that's it. But if it's not forced on you, I can imagine that the income from the transaction can actually be beneficial for that farmer in the long run. There was one recent study, a global study. I'm trying to think of what the results were, that seemed to show that places that are land grabbed, I think, have lesser crop diversity or something like that. It was a global kind of analysis, but that's not surprising, I think.
Okay, no, that's good to know. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know enough to
Yeah.
answer your question. I think I haven't.
No, that's
it's
fine.
a
No
deep-
problem.
yeah.
I think I'll look at that study. Christina is here to ask a question.
Yes, can you hear me? Oh, yes.
Yes.
I was puzzled by the fact that small farms have high productivity and yet smaller profits. And I was wondering if the simple reason for that is that the actual products are used by the small farmers themselves. Or what are the reasons why there's that?
Yeah. So, yeah. I haven't delved deep into that. Just today, I was talking to my PhD student. Didn't publish that paper. He did that analysis as part of his thesis, but we never dove deep into trying to understand why. It was an outcome of. So I didn't talk too much about the detail. It was a RULIS. There was a database called RULIS, which is a household survey data from many countries around the world, and we essentially looked at the outcomes. My guess is that it's simply economies of scale, that basically you're using as you become a larger and larger farm, you're saving in terms of labor. You're basically taking advantage of economies of scale. Partly, and you're probably right. Some of that some of the product even is used for subsistence. And I don't know whether the database actually has information on how much is subsistence or not. So I need to dive deeper before answering your question. That part of the puzzle is still unclear to me.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have a question. Hi,
Mhm,
Navin.
mhm.
So
Hi,
as
Pinky.
you know, I also kind of work in the smallholder agricultural systems in developing countries. And to follow up Baker's request or the question about the contrast that we see here in the US or Canada and other developing countries, based on my own experience, it seems like here it's kind of tied to land ownership, right? So if a farmer here have multiple smaller farms, when we talk to them about, let's say, saltwater intrusion on one of the farms, they're okay giving up that land because they have many other smaller farms that they can use for, whatever reasons. But in the developing countries, most of the times, the small farmers can't afford to do that. And oftentimes, their food production on the subsistence farms are tied to available infrastructure, especially irrigation. And many studies have showed recently that in response to these ongoing climate changes, locally speaking, irrigation might, help, or let's say might have an effect on yield. So locally speaking, the yield might be maintained if they have irrigation access. Now, looking at from the policy perspective, it's easier for the politicians to deliver irrigation, right? They can say, well, elect me, I'll give you groundwater irrigation. But given the situation, especially in India, what's happening with groundwater depletion, and also some of the work that we have done that shows that it actually increases the vulnerability. Because if, as a farmer, I have access to irrigation, I will plant a crop, but there might be other, let's say, temperature increase at a certain point of the phenological stage of this winter crop that will actually lead to crop failure. So what do you think, how as scientists we can deliver a nuanced message and not just say irrigation access would reduce the yield loss? Because from the policy perspective, it's easy to pick that and deliver it, not thinking it in a very nuanced context.
That's a great question. I mean, even more than that, like there are case studies showing that when irrigation access has been provided, farmers then switch crops and start growing sugarcane because now they have plenty of water. So that's even worse, right? Yeah, I agree with your question. Like I've been thinking a lot recently in terms of how we think about supporting farmers, and the typical way we think about supporting farmers is in terms of insurance, right? So in the Canadian context, for example, we started recently talking to insurance providers in the prairies and to see how the system works. But there is also evidence that when you provide those kinds of support systems, I mean, the price support system in the US is a good enough example, that you incentivize bad behavior in some ways, right? So people with insurance will grow crops, they'll do more risky things because they know that they have insurance to fall back on. And so I think my overall thinking on that is that we need to be thinking in terms of biological insurance instead of sort of financial insurance. In terms of, we try to create a system, a biological system, ecological system that's more resilient to shocks, and not simply providing a system, financial or infrastructure, irrigation infrastructure, that kind of stop gaps when things fail. I haven't developed that thought further. But your question on how do we communicate nuanced messages, yeah, it's a really good question. I don't know if I have the answer to that.
No, that's a great point that you make, and definitely this is something I'll definitely want to pick your brain at other point. But I have been thinking about it for a while, and it would be nice to discuss this another time.
Love to.
Thank you so much.
So thank you, Dr. Navin Ramankutty, on behalf of the Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences. We're really thrilled that you were able to join us today. We thank you for this wonderful presentation and discussion. We hope to continue correspondence. And for now, the faculty are leaving in order to give graduate students a chance to ask their questions. And anyone who's in Newark, welcome to come to the happy hour now at the Hillside Park. It's going to be a festival with music and chance to be outside, enjoy the fresh air. So again,
sorry, I can't be there.
Yeah, next time. We'll plan on this gorgeous weather for when you come. So again, thank you. Bye for us for now.
Thank you for inviting me. Yeah.
Pleasure. Thank you.